The sound shouldn't have been there. Marcus stood at the edge of the property line, his boots sinking into the soft earth of what the realtor had called worthless backwoods land, and listened to something that made no sense. A low, mechanical hum emanated from somewhere beneath the overgrown brush and collapsed timber that marked the entrance to the old mine shaft. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, constant, rhythmic, alive. He'd owned this 40-acre plot in rural Montana for exactly 3 days, and already everything the previous owner had told him was proving to be a lie. The mine wasn't just collapsed, it wasn't abandoned, and, most disturbing of all, something down there was still running. Marcus pressed his hand against the weathered wooden beam that framed the shaft entrance. The vibration traveled through the rotting wood and into his palm, a gentle pulse that matched the humming sound. This wasn't the settling of old timbers or the echo of wind through underground passages. This was mechanical, electrical, modern somehow, despite the mine having been officially closed since 1973. The real estate listing had been explicit. The shaft was unstable, dangerous, and completely inaccessible. The price reflected that warning. 40 acres of prime Montana wilderness for just $87,000, a fraction of what comparable land sold for in the region. Marcus had thought he'd found the deal of a lifetime. Now, standing here with his heart racing and that inexplicable hum filling his ears, he wondered what he'd actually bought. The previous owner, an elderly man named Walter Hutchins, had seemed almost desperate to sell. Marcus remembered the way Walter's hands had trembled when signing the deed transfer, how he'd refused to meet Marcus's eyes when discussing the mine. "Don't go near that shaft," Walter had warned, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been sealed for good reason. Some things are better left buried." At the time, Marcus had assumed the old man was being overly cautious, perhaps even superstitious. Rural folk had their stories, their legends about cursed mines and lost fortunes. He'd dismissed it as local color, the kind of tale that added character to a property. But now, with that mechanical pulse vibrating through the earth, Walter's words echoed with an entirely different meaning. Marcus pulled out his phone and checked the signal. 1 bar, barely enough to send a text, let alone make a call. He'd need to document this properly. Maybe contact the county inspector or even the Bureau of Land Management. If there was active equipment down there, someone had to know about it. Someone had to be maintaining it. But who? And why? The mine had been closed for over 50 years. The Hutchins family had owned the land for 3 generations, and according to the county records, no permits had been issued for any work on the property in decades. Yet here it was, undeniable evidence that someone, somewhere, was keeping something operational deep beneath the Montana soil. He circled the shaft entrance, pushing aside overgrown brush and decades of accumulated debris. The wooden framework that held back the earth was old, certainly, but not as decrepit as it should have been. Someone had reinforced it, probably within the last 20 years. The timber showed signs of treatment, the kind of industrial sealant used to prevent rot and insect damage. This wasn't the work of curious teenagers or amateur treasure hunters. This was professional, deliberate, and expensive. Marcus found himself stepping closer to the darkened entrance, his curiosity overriding the instinctive warning signals firing in his brain. The humming grew slightly louder, and with it came something else, a faint smell of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. Before we reveal what Marcus discovered in that mine shaft, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Are you in mining country like Montana? Or somewhere completely different? Drop your location below, and let's see how far this story reaches. The temperature dropped noticeably near the entrance. Marcus could see his breath misting in the air, despite it being a warm June afternoon. The shaft descended at a steep angle, disappearing into absolute darkness about 20 feet in. The humming was definitely louder here, and now he could distinguish other sounds beneath it. A faint clicking, irregular but persistent, like an old hard drive reading data. He pulled a flashlight from his pack and shone it into the depths. The beam revealed something that stopped him cold. About 15 feet down, where the shaft should have been choked with collapsed rock and timber, there was instead a steel door. Modern, industrial, and, judging by the clean edges and intact hinges, recently installed. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. A government facility? Some kind of illegal operation? A prepper's hideout? None of it made sense. This land had been in the Hutchins family since the 1920s. They'd been simple ranchers, not the type to have connections to classified projects or criminal enterprises. Yet there was no denying what he was seeing. Someone had gone to enormous expense and effort to seal this mine shaft, not to keep people out of a dangerous collapse, but to keep something in, or to keep something secret. The clicking sound increased in frequency, and Marcus realized with growing unease that it seemed to be responding to his presence. The moment his flashlight beam hit the steel door, the pattern had changed. He backed away from the entrance, his heart hammering. This was bigger than a property dispute or a zoning violation. This was the kind of discovery that attracted attention from people who didn't appreciate questions. But Marcus had spent 15 years as an investigative journalist before retiring to pursue his dream of rural living. His instincts were screaming that whatever lay behind that door was a story. The kind of story that could explain why this land had been sold so cheaply, why Walter Hutchins had looked so haunted, and why no one in the small town of Copper Ridge had wanted to talk about the old Patterson mine. The humming continued, steady and inexorable, a mechanical heartbeat in the Montana wilderness. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the property, Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow he would return with proper equipment. He would document everything, and one way or another he would find out what was behind that door. But tonight, as he walked back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not by a person, but by something older and more patient. Something that had been waiting in the darkness for someone exactly like him to come along. Someone curious enough to ask the questions that everyone else had been too afraid to voice. The Copper Ridge Historical Society occupied a converted grain silo on the edge of town, its weathered exterior hiding a surprisingly well-organized archive of local history. Marcus arrived when it opened at 9 the next morning, his notebook already filled with questions that had kept him awake most of the night. The Society's curator, a woman in her 70s named Dorothy Brennan, looked up from her desk with the practiced smile of someone used to occasional visitors but not expecting much excitement. That smile faltered when Marcus mentioned the Patterson mine. "I didn't think anyone would buy that property," she said quietly, setting down her coffee. "Walter swore he'd take it to the grave." Marcus laid out copies of his deed and property survey on Dorothy's desk. The Patterson mine appeared on every historical map of the region, a small operation that had produced modest amounts of copper ore from 1897 until its official closure in 1973. Nothing in the public record suggested anything unusual about the mine. It had been one of dozens of small family operations that dotted the Montana landscape during the mining boom. What made it different? Marcus asked, watching Dorothy's expression carefully. She seemed torn between professional courtesy and genuine concern. "The Patterson mine wasn't just a mine," she finally said. "It was an entrance." Dorothy pulled out a leather-bound ledger from a locked cabinet, its pages yellowed with age. The entries dated back to the 1920s, handwritten accounts from various members of the Hutchins family. "Robert Hutchins bought that land in 1921. Dorothy explained, turning to a marked page. "He wasn't a miner. He was an engineer who'd worked for the government during World War I, signals intelligence, from what we can gather. When he came to Copper Ridge, he brought equipment with him. Lots of equipment. The kind that needed constant power and generated enough heat to keep the mine warm, even in the deepest winter." The implications hung in the air between them. This wasn't a story about copper mining. This was about something else entirely. Marcus leaned forward, studying the faded handwriting in the ledger. Robert Hutchins had made regular entries about maintaining the array and monitoring the signal. In 1937, he wrote about installing secondary power systems and ensuring continuity of observation. By 1952, the entries shifted tone. Robert mentioned unexplained interference patterns and anomalous readings that defied conventional explanation. The last entry, dated March 1973, simply read, "Decision made. Sealing primary access. Secondary monitoring to continue indefinitely. May God forgive us for what we're about to hide." 3 weeks later, the Patterson mine was officially declared collapsed and closed to public access. What was he monitoring? Marcus asked, though he suspected Dorothy didn't have a complete answer. She shook her head slowly, closing the ledger with reverent care. Robert never wrote down the full truth, probably for security reasons, but there are rumors, stories that the old-timers used to tell. They said that during the war, the government set up listening posts all over the country, not just for radio signals from enemy agents, but for something else, something they didn't want the public to know about. She paused, seeming to weigh whether to continue. Robert Hutchins died in 1964. His son, Walter's father, maintained the equipment until he passed in '82. Then Walter took over. And now you. Marcus felt a chill despite the warm morning sun streaming through the society's windows. Took over what, exactly? What am I supposed to be maintaining? Dorothy walked to a map on the wall, a detailed topographical survey of the Copper Ridge area from 1955. She pointed to the Patterson mine, then to 3 other locations scattered across the valley. There were 4 sites, she said, 4 families chosen by Robert Hutchins and his government contacts. Each family was responsible for maintaining equipment, keeping it operational, and above all, keeping it secret. The other 3 sites were decommissioned in the 90s, their equipment removed by men in unmarked trucks. But the Patterson mine never got that visit. Walter's father had convinced them to leave it operational, though I don't know why. The Historical Society's records revealed more pieces of the puzzle. Equipment deliveries to the Hutchins property continued well into the 2000s, though disguised as farming supplies or construction materials. Walter had maintained relationships with specific contractors from Seattle and Denver, companies that specialized in telecommunications and data storage. Bank records, accessible through a friendly contact at the county clerk's office, showed regular payments from an account registered to a defense contractor that no longer existed. The money had continued flowing until 2020, when the payments abruptly stopped. 6 months later, Walter Hutchins put the property up for sale. What happened in 2020? Marcus asked, making notes as fast as he could write. Dorothy pulled out a newspaper clipping from April of that year. The headline read, "Pentagon closes secret Cold War monitoring program after 70 years." The article was brief, mentioning the shutdown of various classified listening posts and surveillance stations that had been established during World War II and maintained through the Cold War. The program had cost taxpayers millions over the decades, but according to the official statement, it was now obsolete thanks to satellite technology and modern communications. Walter must have thought it was over, Dorothy said, that he could finally be free of whatever burden his family had been carrying. But the equipment in the mine was still running. Marcus shared this detail with Dorothy, watching her face carefully. She didn't seem surprised. "I've driven past that property at night," she admitted. "Sometimes you can see a faint glow from the direction of the shaft, especially when it's very dark. And there's that sound. Some of us have heard it when the wind is right. We always wondered if Walter had really shut everything down, or if he just couldn't." She met Marcus's eyes with an intensity that spoke of decades of unasked questions. The question isn't whether it's still running. The question is what it's been recording all these years. and whether anyone's been listening to what it found. Marcus left the Historical Society with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer picture of what he was dealing with. The Patterson mine wasn't just an abandoned shaft with forgotten equipment. It was part of a network, a system designed to monitor something important enough to maintain for over 70 years. Robert Hutchins had been part of something significant, something that required absolute secrecy and generational commitment. And now that commitment had fallen to Marcus, whether he wanted it or not. The humming beneath his property wasn't just machinery. It was a legacy, a responsibility, and possibly a warning. As he drove back to the property, Marcus noticed a black SUV parked at the intersection near the Historical Society. It had government plates. The same vehicle was still there when he passed by an hour later, and he could see someone inside watching the building with what appeared to be professional surveillance equipment. Dorothy had stirred something by showing him those records. Or perhaps Marcus's purchase of the property had triggered alarms in places he couldn't yet imagine. Either way, he was now part of something that clearly wasn't as decommissioned as the Pentagon press release had claimed. The equipment was running, someone was still watching, and Marcus was about to discover exactly what the Hutchins family had been guarding all these years. Marcus spent the afternoon gathering equipment from Copper Ridge's only hardware store. The owner, a taciturn man named Bill Ramsey, asked no questions when Marcus purchased climbing rope, industrial-grade flashlights, a portable generator, and a respirator mask. But Marcus caught Bill watching him through the store window as he loaded everything into his truck. That same wary expression he'd seen on Walter Hutchins' face. The whole town seemed to carry a collective secret, a shared understanding that certain things were better left alone. But Marcus had never been good at leaving things alone. By 4 p.m, he was back at the mine shaft, his gear spread out on the ground, his hands already trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The steel door was more imposing in daylight. Marcus could now see details he'd missed the previous evening. A small keypad mounted to the right side, its LED display still glowing a faint green. The door itself was seamless, manufactured from what appeared to be stainless steel with reinforced edges. No rust, no corrosion. This wasn't surplus government equipment from the 1970s. This was modern, probably installed within the last 20 years. Marcus examined the keypad closely. It showed no brand name, no manufacturer's mark, just a simple numeric display reading "Standby" in green letters. Below the display, a small camera lens pointed outward, its red indicator light suggesting it was actively recording. He tried the obvious codes first. Walter's birth year, the year the mine closed, the address of the property. Nothing worked. Each failed attempt resulted in a soft beep and the display flashing red for 2 seconds before returning to green. Marcus counted his attempts carefully. Many security systems locked down after 3 or 5 failed entries, and he couldn't risk triggering an alarm that might bring whoever was monitoring this place. After his 4th attempt, he stopped. The humming continued unchanged, that steady, mechanical rhythm that seemed to pulse through the very rock surrounding the shaft. Marcus pressed his ear against the steel door. Beyond the humming, he could now hear something else, a rhythmic clicking and whirring like tape reels spinning. The realization hit him with sudden clarity. This wasn't just recording equipment. This was archival storage. Whatever data the system was collecting, it was being preserved on physical media, not just digital storage. That suggested either extreme paranoia about digital security or a system so old that it predated modern data storage conventions. But the equipment was clearly maintained, clearly functional. Someone had been updating and servicing this installation for decades, keeping it operational through multiple generations of technology. The question was whether they were still actively monitoring it, or if it had become automated, a forgotten system running on its own inertia. Marcus made a decision. He couldn't access the door through conventional means, but he might be able to access the mine through an alternate route. The geological survey maps Dorothy had shown him indicated that the Patterson mine connected to several other shafts in the area, part of an interconnected network of passages that honeycombed the mountain. Most of those connections had been sealed in the 1950s for safety reasons, but Marcus remembered seeing what looked like a ventilation shaft about half a mile northeast of the main entrance. If he could locate it, if it was still accessible, he might be able to enter the mine system from an unexpected direction. The hike took 40 minutes through dense forest and over rocky terrain that showed no signs of recent human passage. Marcus used his GPS to navigate, marking waypoints as he went. The ventilation shaft, when he found it, was exactly where the survey maps indicated, a vertical opening about 3 feet in diameter, protected by an ancient iron grate that had long since rusted through. Marcus shone his flashlight down into the darkness. The shaft descended straight down for approximately 30 feet before angling toward what he assumed was the main mine passage. The walls were rough-hewn rock with occasional iron rungs forming a crude ladder. Many of the rungs had rusted away completely. If you're enjoying this discovery and want to see what Marcus finds at the bottom of this shaft, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because what he's about to uncover will change everything he thought he knew about this property. Marcus secured his climbing rope to a sturdy pine tree and tested it with his full weight. It held. He lowered his equipment pack first, listening to it scrape against the stone walls as it descended. When it hit bottom with a dull thud, he began his own descent. The rope bit into his hands even through his gloves, and the walls of the shaft seemed to press in on him as he went lower. The temperature dropped with each foot of descent, and the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, machine oil and ozone. The humming was louder here, transmitted through the rock itself, vibrating in his chest like a second heartbeat. His feet touched solid ground after what felt like an eternity but had probably been less than 5 minutes. Marcus found himself in a horizontal passage, roughly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, its walls showing the marks of hand tools from over a century ago. The passage extended in 2 directions, but only one direction carried the sound of machinery. Marcus retrieved his pack, checked his flashlight, and began moving toward the humming. The passage twisted and turned, occasionally branching off into smaller side tunnels that disappeared into darkness. He marked each intersection with reflective tape, creating a trail he could follow back to the surface. After approximately 200 yards, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Marcus stopped at the entrance, his flashlight beam revealing something that shouldn't exist in an abandoned copper mine. The chamber had been converted into what looked like a control room from a 1960s science fiction movie. Banks of equipment lined the walls, their indicator lights glowing in the darkness like electronic stars. Tape reels spun slowly behind protective glass panels. Oscilloscopes displayed waveforms that pulsed and shifted in patterns Marcus couldn't interpret. And in the center of it all, mounted on a reinforced concrete pedestal, was a massive antenna array pointed straight down into the earth. The equipment was a bizarre mixture of vintage and modern technology. Vacuum tubes glowed alongside LED displays. Mechanical switches sat next to touchscreen monitors. Someone had been updating this installation piecemeal over decades, maintaining its core functionality while gradually incorporating newer components. A thick bundle of cables ran from the equipment array through a hole drilled in the chamber wall, disappearing into the rock. Marcus followed the cables with his flashlight beam and realized they led toward the sealed steel door he'd discovered earlier. This was the other side of that installation. This was where the real work was happening. Marcus approached the main control panel carefully, half expecting alarms to sound or security measures to activate. Nothing happened. The equipment continued its patient work, recording and monitoring whatever signal it had been designed to detect. A logbook sat on a metal desk next to the panel, its pages filled with handwritten entries in multiple hands spanning decades. Marcus opened it to the most recent page. The last entry was dated November 14, 2024, just over a year ago. It was signed W.H. and consisted of a single sentence. Signal intensity increasing beyond predicted parameters. God help us all. Marcus's hands shook as he turned back through the logbook pages. The entries painted a picture of obsessive monitoring spanning 3 generations of the Hutchins family. Robert Hutchins' early entries from the 1940s were clinical and precise, recording signal strength, frequency variations, and equipment maintenance schedules. He referred to the monitoring project as Operation Deep Ear, a name that appeared nowhere in any official government records Marcus had seen. The entries suggested Robert believed he was tracking Soviet submarine communications or underground nuclear testing. But as the decades progressed, the tone of the entries shifted from scientific confidence to something closer to dread. By the 1960s, Robert was writing about anomalous patterns that don't match any known communication protocol and signal characteristics suggesting non-human origin. His son, Thomas Hutchins, took over the monitoring duties in 1965, and his entries showed even greater concern. "The signal is not random noise," Thomas wrote in March 1968. "It's structured, mathematical. Father believed it was just geological interference, but I've run the patterns through every analysis protocol available. This is intentional communication, and it's coming from approximately 4 miles beneath the surface. Nothing we've built reaches that deep. Nothing should be operating at those depths." Walter Hutchins' entries began in 1983, shortly after his father's death. His early notes were skeptical, suggesting he thought his father and grandfather had been misinterpreting natural geological phenomena. But by 1987, Walter's tone had changed. "Spent 6 months analyzing the data with equipment from MIT," he wrote, "brought in 3 specialists under false pretenses, told them it was seismic research. All 3 reached the same conclusion independently. This is not a natural signal. The mathematical structures embedded in the waveforms are too complex, too precise. One specialist suggested it might be echo artifacts from Cold War testing. But the signal predates those tests by at least 2 decades, possibly longer." Marcus set down the logbook and examined the equipment more carefully. The oscilloscopes showed multiple waveforms, each one pulsing at different frequencies. He had enough engineering background to recognize that these weren't simple radio waves or seismic vibrations. The patterns were complex, layered, almost musical in their structure. As he watched, the waveforms shifted subtly, creating new patterns that seemed to respond to each other in ways that suggested intelligence, or at least something that could mimic intelligence. The tape reels continued their slow rotation, preserving every moment of this mysterious transmission on magnetic media that could survive electromagnetic pulses or digital corruption. A folder on the desk caught Marcus's attention. It was marked "Classified Eyes Only" in faded red letters, though the security classification appeared unofficial, probably applied by Robert Hutchins himself. Inside, Marcus found correspondence between Robert and various government officials from the 1940s and 50s. The letters confirmed that Operation Deep Ear had been a legitimate military intelligence project, initially designed to detect enemy communications transmitted through the Earth itself. During World War II, there had been concerns that Axis powers were using ground conduction techniques to communicate with agents in America without being detected by conventional radio intercepts. But the project had discovered something unexpected. According to a memo dated July 1946, 4 monitoring stations across Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico had all detected the same signal, a low-frequency transmission originating from deep underground, far below any known mine or natural cave system. The signal was strongest in the Montana location, which became the primary monitoring site. The other 3 stations were maintained as secondary observation points. "The signal appears to be a form of communication," the memo stated, "but between what or whom remains unknown. Recommend continued monitoring and analysis. Potential threat assessment. Unknown." Further documents revealed that the government had attempted to drill down to the signal's source in 1951. The operation, conducted under the cover story of geothermal research, had reached a depth of 3.7 miles before encountering what the drilling report described as impenetrable substrate of unknown composition. The drill bits, made from industrial diamonds, had been destroyed trying to penetrate this mysterious layer. Subsequent attempts met the same fate. In 1953, the drilling operation was abandoned, and the decision was made to continue passive monitoring indefinitely. The project was classified at the highest level and removed from all official budgets, maintained through a network of private contractors and families like the Hutchins. Marcus found a more recent document, a printout of an email dated April 2020. It was from someone identified only as coordinator and addressed to Walter Hutchins. The decision has been made to terminate all remaining deep ear stations, the email read. 75 years of monitoring has produced no actionable intelligence and no confirmed threat. Satellite and deep Earth imaging technology has advanced to the point where ground-based listening posts are obsolete. Your service to this program and your family's dedication over 3 generations is deeply appreciated. Final equipment removal is scheduled for August 2020. Please ensure all archival materials are prepared for transport. But the equipment was still here, still running. Marcus checked the dates again. August 2020 had come and gone over 5 years ago. The removal team had never arrived, or Walter had refused them access. Either way, the monitoring continued uninterrupted, the signal persisted, and whatever was transmitting from 4 miles beneath Montana was still active. Marcus turned back to the oscilloscopes, watching the waveforms pulse and shift. As he stared at them, he began to notice something the Hutchins family had probably observed decades ago. The patterns weren't random. They repeated in cycles, complex mathematical sequences that resembled nothing so much as a countdown. Marcus pulled out his phone to take photographs of the equipment, the logbook entries, and the documents. No signal, of course. He was too deep underground for cellular reception. He'd have to rely on his memory and handwritten notes. As he worked, documenting everything he could see, the humming suddenly changed. The pitch dropped slightly, becoming deeper, more resonant. The oscilloscopes showed the waveforms intensifying, their amplitude increasing dramatically. The tape reels spun faster, their motors straining to keep up with the increased data flow. Something was happening. The signal was changing, just as Walter's final entry had warned, and Marcus realized with growing dread that his presence here, his investigation, might have triggered something. The chamber's lights flickered, powered by the same generator that ran the monitoring equipment. Marcus grabbed his pack and the logbook, making a split-second decision. He needed to get this information to the surface, to experts who could understand what it meant. But he also needed to see what was happening with the main sealed entrance to understand the full scope of this installation. He moved quickly through the connecting passage, following the cable bundles toward the steel door. The humming grew louder with each step, and now he could feel it in his bones, a vibration that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. Whatever was transmitting from deep below was waking up, responding to something. And Marcus couldn't shake the terrible feeling that it was responding to him. The passage narrowed as Marcus approached the steel door from the interior side. Here, the installation revealed its true complexity. The door wasn't just a barrier, it was part of an elaborate security system that included pressure sensors, motion detectors, and what appeared to be a primitive but functional biometric scanner. Everything was connected to a backup power system consisting of dozens of industrial batteries, themselves connected to solar panels that must have been installed somewhere on the surface, hidden from casual observation. The Hutchins family had spared no expense in keeping this system operational, ensuring that even if the main power failed, the monitoring would continue uninterrupted for months or even years. Marcus examined the interior control panel. Unlike the exterior keypad, This side had manual override switches and a small emergency release handle protected by a locked metal cover. The lock was old, a simple tumbler mechanism that looked like it dated from the original installation. Marcus pulled out his multi-tool and worked at the lock for several minutes, his hands slick with sweat despite the cool underground air. Finally, it gave way with a satisfying click. Inside the protective cover, the emergency release handle was marked with faded yellow and black hazard stripes and a warning label. Emergency use only. Opening this door will trigger immediate notification to monitoring authority. So there was still someone watching. Someone who would know the moment this door opened from the inside. Marcus hesitated, weighing his options. He could retreat, climb back out through the ventilation shaft and pretend he'd never found any of this. He could sell the property, walk away, and let someone else deal with whatever secret the Hutchins family had been guarding. But journalists didn't walk away from stories, especially stories this significant. Whatever was happening 4 miles below Montana, whatever that signal represented, the public had a right to know. The government had classified this project for 75 years, and clearly they'd been content to let it continue running even after officially terminating it. That suggested something important, something they didn't want examined too closely. Marcus pulled the emergency release handle. Alarms immediately began wailing throughout the underground complex, their shriek echoing off the stone walls. Red emergency lights activated along the passage ceiling, casting everything in a hellish glow. The steel door's locking mechanism disengaged with a series of heavy metallic thuds, and the door swung inward on well-oiled hinges. Beyond it lay another chamber, smaller than the control room but far more disturbing in its contents. Filing cabinets lined every wall, each one labeled with date ranges spanning from 1946 to the present day. In the center of the room stood a modern server rack, its indicator lights blinking steadily, connected to a satellite uplink system that obviously transmitted data to somewhere far from this isolated Montana mountainside. Marcus moved to the nearest filing cabinet and pulled open a drawer. Inside were detailed reports, photographs, and analysis documents related to the signal. The earliest reports were military in nature, focused on threat assessment and cryptographic analysis. But as the years progressed, the reports shifted focus. By the 1970s, the analysis had become more scientific, less concerned with military threats and more interested in understanding the fundamental nature of what they were observing. Reports from universities, think tanks, and private research laboratories filled the drawers. Whoever was funding this operation had consulted with some of the best minds in physics, geology, mathematics, and even linguistics. One report from 1989 caught Marcus's attention. It was authored by a team from Stanford University who had been given access to 6 months of signal data under the pretense that they were analyzing seismic patterns. Their conclusion was startling. The signal demonstrates characteristics consistent with artificial intelligence communication protocols. The mathematical structures embedded within the waveforms suggest information compression and error correction algorithms far more sophisticated than anything currently in human use. If this is a natural phenomenon, it represents a form of geological process unknown to science. If it is artificial, it predates human technological civilization by a significant margin. The report recommended immediate expansion of the monitoring program and suggested drilling operations to establish direct contact with the source. That recommendation had been stamped "Rejected" in red ink, with a handwritten note in the margin. Drilling Operation 1951 proved contact attempts are inadvisable. Source demonstrates awareness of surface activity. Maintain passive observation only. Any attempt at direct communication carries unacceptable risk. The note was signed with initials Marcus couldn't decipher, but the date was April 1990, suggesting someone high-level was still actively managing the project 3 decades after it had supposedly become a routine monitoring operation. The government wasn't just collecting data. They were actively suppressing any attempt to understand or communicate with whatever was transmitting from below. Marcus photographed as many documents as he could, working quickly despite the wailing alarms. The server rack drew his attention next. Its displays showed real-time data feeds being transmitted to IP addresses registered to defense contractors and government agencies. The monitoring wasn't abandoned. It was fully active, probably more active now than it had been in decades. Walter Hutchins hadn't been the last person maintaining this site. He'd just been the last person physically present. The entire operation had been automated, with data flowing continuously to analysts who reviewed it remotely. Marcus's purchase of the property had probably triggered alerts in multiple agencies, and his presence here was almost certainly being tracked right now. A 3-ring binder on a desk near the server rack contained the most recent analysis reports. Marcus flipped through pages of spectral analysis, frequency mapping, and pattern recognition studies dated within the last 6 months. One page made his blood run cold. It was titled, Signal Intensification Event, November 2024 to present. The report detailed a dramatic increase in signal strength and complexity beginning exactly when Walter Hutchins had made his final logbook entry. The signal has increased in amplitude by 47% over the past 13 months, the report stated. Pattern analysis suggests this is not random fluctuation but rather a deliberate escalation. The source appears to be attempting to increase the range and clarity of its transmission. Purpose unknown. Recommend immediate assessment of containment protocols. Containment protocols. The phrase suggested this wasn't just about monitoring. There were contingencies in place, plans for what to do if whatever was down there became too active or too threatening. Marcus turned to the back of the binder and found a sealed envelope marked Emergency Response Protocol, to be opened only under Directive Omega conditions. He broke the seal and pulled out a single page of instructions. The protocol was simple and terrifying. If the signal reached a specific threshold of intensity, if its pattern suggested imminent surface breach, or if unauthorized parties gained access to the monitoring site, a fail-safe system would activate. The entire mine complex, along with all its equipment and anyone inside it, would be sealed permanently using explosive charges positioned throughout the tunnel system. Marcus looked up at the ceiling and noticed for the first time the small charges mounted at regular intervals along the support beams. They were small, professionally installed, and almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. The failsafe was real, and judging by the dust covering the charges, it had been in place for decades. He was standing in what could become his tomb if someone in a distant office decided that containing the secret of the Patterson mine was more important than one curious property owner's life. The alarms continued their urgent wailing, and Marcus knew he had minutes at most before someone responded to the breach. He grabbed the emergency protocol document, stuffed it into his pack along with his photographs and notes, and ran back toward the passage that would lead him to the ventilation shaft in the surface. Marcus had climbed approximately 20 feet up the ventilation shaft when he heard the helicopters. 2 of them, maybe 3, their rotors cutting through the Montana afternoon with military precision. They were directly overhead within minutes of his emergency exit, which meant they'd been close, probably waiting at a nearby airfield for exactly this scenario. Marcus pressed himself against the shaft wall, hidden by the rusty grate that covered the opening above him, and watched through the gaps as men in tactical gear fast-roped down to the forest floor. They moved with the efficiency of Special Operations Forces, immediately establishing a perimeter around the main mine entrance. One team disappeared into the shaft while another began setting up what looked like mobile communication equipment. He waited, barely breathing, as the teams worked. They clearly knew the mine's layout intimately. Within 10 minutes, they had portable lights running through the main passage and were systematically checking every chamber. Marcus could hear their radio chatter echoing up through the ventilation shaft. Technical jargon about data integrity, system status, and security protocols. They weren't there to destroy the site. They were there to secure it, to ensure the monitoring equipment remained operational, and, more importantly, to determine what Marcus had seen and taken. One voice, clearly in command, kept repeating the same question. Any sign of the civilian? Has he removed any materials from the archive? Marcus remained frozen in place for over an hour, his muscles screaming from the awkward position, his mind racing through options. He couldn't climb out while the helicopter circled overhead. He couldn't go back down without running directly into the response team. His only choice was to wait and hope they would conclude he'd somehow escaped before they arrived. Finally, as the sun began to set, he heard the command team leader giving orders to establish a permanent presence at the site. "Set up the observation post at grid reference 77 Bravo," the leader instructed. "I want 24/7 monitoring of both access points. Civilian owner is to be located and contained for debriefing. Non-lethal protocols until we assess information compromise." The phrase, "contained for debriefing," sent a chill down Marcus's spine. These weren't local law enforcement or even FBI agents. This was something else entirely. Probably a special access program that officially didn't exist. People who got debriefed by teams like this tended to disappear, their questions unanswered, their discoveries buried under national security classifications that would outlive them by decades. Marcus had to get out, get somewhere public, and get his story to people who could help protect him. Journalists had networks for exactly these situations. Lawyers who specialized in whistleblower protection, media outlets that could publish information too sensitive to suppress, contacts in Congress who asked uncomfortable questions about classified programs. As darkness fell, the helicopters finally departed, leaving behind a team of 6 operatives who began establishing their observation post near the main shaft entrance. Marcus waited another 30 minutes to be sure, then slowly, silently, began climbing the remaining distance to the surface. He emerged into the forest well after dark, using the tree line for cover as he made his way back to where he'd left his truck. It was gone. In its place was a handwritten note pinned to a tree with a tactical knife. "Mr. Chen, we need to talk. You've stumbled into something classified at the highest level. Running will only make this harder. Report to the Copper Ridge Sheriff's Station tomorrow at 0800 hours. Come alone. Bring everything you took from the site. Cooperation means this stays administrative. Resistance means something else entirely." Marcus pulled the knife from the tree and pocketed it, a small act of defiance that felt absurdly important. They had his truck, his registration, his address. They obviously knew exactly who he was and probably had his entire background by now. 15 years as an investigative journalist would be flagged in their system, marking him as someone potentially problematic, someone who knew how to get information out even under pressure. That might protect him, or it might make him a bigger target. He had to assume they were monitoring his phone, his email, probably even his credit cards. Any attempt to contact his old colleagues directly would be intercepted. He needed to be smarter than that. The hike back to town took 3 hours through rough terrain in complete darkness. Marcus used his phone's GPS sparingly, knowing that every time he powered it on, he was broadcasting his location. He stayed off trails, moving through dense forest and across rocky slopes that left him bruised and exhausted. Copper Ridge appeared below him finally, its streetlights glowing like a constellation in the valley. Marcus approached from the east, avoiding the main roads, cutting through residential backyards and empty lots. He made his way to the public library, a modest brick building that stayed open until 9 p.m. on weeknights. The librarian, a young woman engrossed in her own book, barely looked up as Marcus slipped inside. The library's computer system was old but functional. Marcus created a temporary email account using false information and began uploading the photographs he'd taken in the mine. He sent copies to 3 different journalists he'd worked with over the years, people he trusted to take the information seriously. The message was brief. Government has been monitoring unknown signal from 4 miles underground for 75 years. Signal is increasing in intensity. Source demonstrates characteristics of artificial intelligence. Full documentation attached. If you don't hear from me within 48 hours, publish everything. He sent the emails through a VPN service, adding layers of anonymization that might buy him a few hours before the security teams traced them. Next, he composed a longer document. Everything he'd learned about the Patterson Mine, Operation Deep Ear, the Hutchins family's three-generation watch, and the government's ongoing efforts to suppress information about whatever was transmitting from deep beneath Montana. He uploaded this to multiple cloud storage services, shared the links with a dozen different contacts, and posted cryptic hints about the story on several journalism forums where his colleagues would recognize his writing style. If something happened to him, if the security team decided that containment required more than just debriefing, the information would still get out. They couldn't suppress a story that was already distributed across dozens of servers and hundreds of potential investigators. As Marcus worked, his mind kept returning to Walter Hutchins's final logbook entry. Signal intensity increasing beyond predicted parameters. God help us all. What had Walter understood that Marcus was only beginning to grasp? The monitoring operation wasn't just about gathering intelligence on a mysterious phenomenon. It was about watching something, waiting for something. The emergency response protocols, the explosives positioned throughout the mine, the immediate military response to Marcus's intrusion, all of it suggested that the government expected something to happen. They were preparing for a contingency where whatever was transmitting from 4 miles down might break through to the surface. The Stanford report had mentioned that the drilling operation in 1951 had demonstrated the source's awareness of surface activity. What if the decades of monitoring hadn't been passive observation? What if the signal was aware it was being monitored? What if its increasing intensity wasn't random, but rather a response, an attempt to communicate or even to break free from whatever constraints kept it confined to the deep earth? The mathematical patterns, the artificial intelligence characteristics, the sophisticated information compression, all of it pointed to something that thought, that planned, that acted with purpose. And humanity had been poking at it with drill bits and listening equipment for 75 years. Marcus finished uploading his documentation and cleared the browser history, though he knew it wouldn't really hide his activities from determined investigators. He left the library through a side exit and made his way to the small motel on the edge of town. He paid cash for a room, using a false name that the elderly clerk didn't question. In the room, Marcus spread out all the documents he'd taken from the mine archive, arranging them chronologically on the bed. The story they told was clear. The government had discovered something in 1946 that terrified them. They'd tried to reach it in 1951 and failed. They'd monitored it for decades, consulting with experts who all reached similar conclusions. This was not natural, not human, and potentially not safe. And now, in 2025, it was waking up. The question that kept Marcus awake as midnight approached wasn't whether he should meet with the security team tomorrow. That decision was already made. He had no choice. The question was what he would tell them, how much he would reveal about the information he'd already distributed, and whether cooperation or resistance offered the better chance of survival. Whatever happened in that meeting, whatever threats or promises they made, Marcus knew one thing with certainty. The story of the Patterson Mine wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the 3 journalists who now had his documentation, to the colleagues who would start asking questions if he disappeared, and ultimately to a public that deserved to know what was happening beneath their feet. The signal was real. It was intensifying. And soon everyone would have to confront what that meant. Marcus arrived at the Copper Ridge Sheriff's Station at precisely 8 in the morning, carrying a backpack that contained copies of some documents, but not all of them. He'd hidden the original emergency protocol papers in a safety deposit box at the town's only bank, along with a signed statement detailing everything he'd discovered. If he didn't return to retrieve them within 72 hours, the bank manager had instructions to contact Marcus's attorney in Seattle. It was a thin layer of protection, but it was something. The sheriff's station parking lot contained 3 black SUVs with government plates and a mobile communications van bristling with satellite dishes. This wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. Inside, the small-town sheriff's department had been transformed into a temporary command center. The waiting area had been cleared of civilians, and men in dark suits occupied every available space. A woman in her 40s, wearing business attire that screamed federal authority, stood as Marcus entered. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice professionally neutral. "Thank you for coming. I'm Director Sarah Peterson with the Defense Intelligence Agency. We have a great deal to discuss." She gestured toward the sheriff's private office, which had been commandeered for the meeting. Marcus noticed the sheriff himself was nowhere to be seen. This was entirely federal now, local law enforcement pushed aside. The office contained 4 people besides Marcus and Director Peterson. 2 were obvious security personnel, standing near the door with the relaxed alertness of people trained for violence. The other 2 were older men, one in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Dr. Raymond Kowalski from the Department of Energy, the other in military dress uniform with stars on his shoulders, General Thomas Brightwell, United States Strategic Command. This wasn't just an intelligence operation. This was top-level military and scientific leadership, which meant Marcus had stumbled into something far more significant than he'd imagined. The Patterson mine wasn't just a monitoring station. It was critical infrastructure for something that spanned multiple government agencies. Director Peterson opened a tablet and pulled up images of Marcus inside the mine complex, time-stamped from the previous afternoon. The photographs were crystal clear. Obviously, from hidden cameras Marcus hadn't noticed. "Let's establish some facts," Peterson began. "You entered a classified government installation without authorization. You accessed materials marked as restricted under national security provisions. You photographed classified documents and removed physical evidence from a secure facility. Under normal circumstances, you would already be in federal custody facing charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences of 15 years. Are we clear on the severity of this situation?" Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Let's also establish some facts from my perspective," he replied. "I purchased private property through legitimate channels. I discovered equipment on my land that was never disclosed during the sale. I found evidence of a classified program that's been deceiving the American public for 75 years. And I documented evidence of a potential threat that your agencies have been monitoring but not revealing to the people who have a right to know. So, before we discuss my unauthorized access, perhaps we should discuss your unauthorized presence on my property and your failure to inform me that I was purchasing land with active classified operations." The room went silent for a moment. General Brightwell leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said simply. "The sale should never have been approved. We have Walter Hutchins to thank for that complication. He listed the property before informing us of his intentions, and by the time we knew about it, you'd already closed the deal. Retroactively blocking the sale would have drawn exactly the attention we've spent decades avoiding. So, yes, we screwed up. But that doesn't change the fact that you now possess information that could cause significant public panic if mishandled." Dr. Kowalski pulled out a folder containing printed versions of the documents Marcus had photographed. "How much do you understand about what you found down there?" he asked. Marcus considered his response carefully. "I understand that something is transmitting from approximately 4 miles underground. I understand that it's been doing this since at least the 1940s, possibly much longer. I understand that your experts believe it demonstrates characteristics of artificial intelligence and that its signal is intensifying. And I understand that you've prepared emergency protocols to seal the mine if it becomes threatening. What I don't understand is what it actually is and why you've kept it secret for so long." Peterson and Kowalski exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Peterson nodded slightly, and Kowalski opened a different folder, this one marked with classification stamps Marcus didn't recognize. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at a level that requires congressional oversight approval to disclose," Kowalski said. "The fact that we're sharing it with you represents a significant departure from protocol. But given that you've already disseminated information to outside parties, yes, we know about your emails and uploads. We've determined that controlled disclosure is preferable to letting you operate with incomplete understanding." He paused, then continued. "The signal isn't a transmission in the conventional sense. It's a containment field." The words didn't make immediate sense. Marcus frowned. A containment field for what? Kowalski pulled out geological surveys, technical diagrams, and what appeared to be three-dimensional imaging of the subsurface structure beneath the Patterson mine. In 1946, during the initial monitoring operations, our equipment detected not just the signal but also what it was containing, a massive void space approximately 4.3 miles below the surface. This void is roughly 3 miles in diameter and perfectly spherical, which is geologically impossible under natural circumstances. The walls of the void generate the signal, a continuous electromagnetic and acoustic pattern that maintains structural integrity and prevents collapse. But more significantly, the signal appears to be keeping something inside the void from coming out. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. What's inside the void? General Brightwell took over the explanation. "We don't know. The 1951 drilling operation was an attempt to breach the void and find out. The moment our drill bit penetrated what we thought was solid rock, the signal intensity increased by 300%. The drill crew experienced immediate equipment failures, hallucinations, and what military psychologists later classified as induced paranoia and aggression. 2 crew members tried to kill each other before we could evacuate the site. The signal returned to baseline levels within hours of us withdrawing, but the message was clear. The containment field was responding to intrusion, and whatever it was protecting, or imprisoning, didn't want visitors." The implications crashed over Marcus like a physical wave. The government hadn't just been monitoring a geological curiosity. They'd been watching a prison, something deliberately constructed or naturally formed to contain something that couldn't be allowed to reach the surface. "How long has it been there?" he asked quietly. Dr. Kowalski shook his head. "That's one of the biggest mysteries. Our best geological analysis suggests the void has existed for at least 50,000 years, possibly much longer. The rock surrounding it shows no signs of human excavation or construction. If this is artificial, it predates human civilization by a significant margin. If it's natural, it represents a geological process we can't explain and technology we don't understand embedded in prehistoric rock formations." Director Peterson brought up a graph on her tablet showing signal intensity over time. The line remained relatively stable from the 1940s through the early 2000s, then began climbing gradually around 2010. In November 2024, the climb became exponential. "Whatever is inside that void is becoming more active," she explained. "The containment field is strengthening in response, which is what we're detecting as increased signal intensity. We don't know if this means the entity inside is trying to escape or if it's responding to external stimuli. But we do know that if the containment field fails, we have no idea what will happen. That's why the monitoring continues. That's why the emergency protocols exist. And that's why we need your cooperation, not your journalism." Marcus understood the pitch now. They were offering him the truth in exchange for his silence. They wanted him to become part of the conspiracy. Another Walter Hutchins maintaining the watch and keeping the secret. But Marcus also understood something they might not have fully considered. If this information was as critical as they claimed, the public deserved to know. People living above a potential catastrophe had the right to understand the risk. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked. "What happens if I publish everything I know?" General Brightwell's expression hardened. "Then we invoke national security protocols that will make your information disappear from every platform you've uploaded it to. We'll discredit you professionally, and you'll spend the next several years fighting legal battles while sitting in a federal detention facility. But more importantly, you'll cause mass panic that serves no practical purpose. There's nothing the public can do about this situation. We have the world's best minds working on understanding it. We have contingency plans for multiple scenarios. What we don't have is a solution to public hysteria. The meeting continued for another 3 hours. Director Peterson and her team walking Marcus through classified briefings that painted a picture of a government struggling with knowledge it couldn't fully understand. They showed him analysis from the world's leading physicists, geologists, and computer scientists. They demonstrated how the signal's mathematical structures had helped advance artificial intelligence research, quantum computing, and materials science, side benefits of studying something far beyond human engineering. They revealed that similar voids existed in 4 other locations worldwide: beneath the Ural Mountains in Russia, under the Australian outback, deep below the Amazon basin, and somewhere in the Antarctic ice. All 5 demonstrated identical containment field characteristics. The international community knew about these sites. Russia had attempted its own drilling operation in 1967 with results even more catastrophic than America's experience. 3 researchers had died under circumstances the Soviet government never fully explained. China had discovered the Amazon site during geological surveys in 2003 and immediately established their own monitoring program. The Antarctic void had only been confirmed in 2015, and no nation had yet attempted to investigate it directly. There was an informal agreement among the major powers: monitor, but don't interfere. Watch, but don't touch. The voids were either prisons for something that shouldn't be released, or warnings from a previous civilization about dangers they'd barely contained. Dr. Kowalski presented Marcus with the most recent analysis of the signal's evolution. Over the past 13 months, we've detected what appears to be communication attempts within the signal structure, he explained, pointing to complex waveform patterns. Not communication directed at us necessarily, but communication between something inside the void and the containment field itself. It's as if whatever is imprisoned is negotiating with its prison, testing boundaries, seeking weaknesses. Our artificial intelligence model suggests that if the current rate of intensification continues, the containment field will reach critical threshold in approximately 18 months. What happens at that threshold is anyone's guess. Marcus studied the patterns, his engineering background helping him understand the implications, even if he couldn't grasp all the technical details. "You're saying we have less than 2 years before something changes," he said. "What are you doing to prepare?" General Brightwell pulled out maps showing military installations, evacuation routes, and what Marcus recognized as strategic defense positions. "We're preparing for every scenario we can imagine," Brightwell replied. "Best case, the containment field stabilizes at a new baseline, and we continue monitoring as we have for decades. Worst case, the field collapses, and whatever is inside emerges. We have contingencies ranging from conventional military response to tactical nuclear options as a last resort." The phrase "tactical nuclear options" hung in the air like a death sentence for everyone living in Montana, Wyoming, and the surrounding states. Marcus felt sick. "You're telling me that the government is prepared to detonate nuclear weapons on American soil if this thing breaks free?" Brightwell's expression didn't change. "We're prepared to do whatever is necessary to protect the broader population. The Patterson mine area is sparsely populated. The immediate blast radius would affect fewer than 50,000 people. Regrettable, but acceptable compared to the alternative of an unknown entity with capabilities we can't predict reaching major population centers. It's the same calculus we used during the Cold War. Some sacrifices are necessary to protect the whole." Director Peterson interrupted before Marcus could respond. "But we don't think it will come to that," she said quickly. "The field has shown remarkable stability for millennia. Even with the current intensification, our models suggest an 87% probability of natural stabilization within the next 2 years. We're being cautious, maintaining readiness, but not panicking. What we need from you, Mr. Chen, is perspective. You're an investigative journalist. You understand how information can be weaponized, how truth without context can cause more harm than ignorance. We're asking you to consider whether the public interest is really served by revealing something that will cause fear but offer no actionable solutions. It was a compelling argument, and Marcus could see the logic behind it. But he could also see the paternalism, the assumption that those in power knew better than the people they served. This was how governments rationalized every secret, every cover-up. We're protecting you by keeping you ignorant. Marcus thought about the Hutchins family, 3 generations living with the weight of this knowledge, unable to share the burden or seek help from the broader community. Walter's final desperate warning in the logbook suggested that solitude, that isolation with terrible knowledge, had taken its toll. How many others were out there, watching their assigned voids, carrying secrets that crushed them? "What do you want from me specifically?" Marcus asked. Director Peterson pulled out a document, a non-disclosure agreement backed by the full force of federal law. "We want you to sign this, acknowledging that you've been briefed on matters of national security and agreeing to maintain confidentiality. In exchange, we'll grant you limited access to ongoing research. You'll receive quarterly briefings on the signal's status. You can maintain ownership of your property, though the mine itself will remain under federal jurisdiction, and will ensure that the journalists you contacted receive visits from our public affairs team, explaining why publishing your information would harm national security. Most importantly, you'll be protected. There are elements within the intelligence community who favor more aggressive approaches to security breaches. This agreement puts you under official protection protocols." Marcus read through the agreement carefully. It was comprehensive, binding him to secrecy for the rest of his life with penalties including imprisonment and financial ruin for violations. But it also granted him something valuable: continued access to information. If he signed, he wouldn't be shut out. He'd be part of the monitoring effort, able to watch as events unfolded and perhaps warn people if the situation deteriorated beyond the government's optimistic projections. If he refused to sign, he'd be arrested, his credibility destroyed, and the information suppressed anyway. The choice wasn't between disclosure and silence. It was between informed silence and isolated ignorance. "I need guarantees," Marcus said finally. "If the signal reaches critical threshold, if your models show that containment failure is imminent, the public gets warned. No more secrets, no more calculations about acceptable losses. People deserve the chance to evacuate, to prepare, to say goodbye to their families if necessary. That's non-negotiable." He watched the federal officials exchange glances. Silent negotiations happening behind professional masks. Finally, Director Peterson nodded slowly. "If we reach 90% probability of containment failure, we initiate public evacuation protocols under the cover of geological instability concerns. We can agree to that. It's actually consistent with our existing plans, just accelerates the timeline slightly." Marcus signed the document, his hand steady despite the enormity of what he was agreeing to. He was now part of Operation Deep Ear, the newest member of a conspiracy that stretched back 75 years and would likely continue long after his death. As he signed, he thought about the question that had driven him since discovering the humming beneath his property. What was down there? The government's answer was terrifying in its uncertainty. They didn't know. They'd been watching for 3/4 of a century, and they still didn't know. It could be a natural phenomenon, some kind of geological intelligence. It could be a prisoner from an ancient civilization, locked away for crimes beyond imagination. It could be something that defied every category humans use to understand their world. What Marcus did know was that it was real. The signal was intensifying. The containment field was responding. And in approximately 18 months, humanity might finally learn what had been hiding beneath Montana since before recorded history began. As he left the sheriff's station, walking out into bright morning sunlight that seemed almost offensive in its normalcy, Marcus pulled out his phone. The emails he'd sent had already been intercepted, his contacts already visited by very convincing federal agents. The story was contained, the secret maintained. But Marcus had insisted on one final concession. He would write an account of everything he'd learned, seal it with his attorney, to be opened if he died unexpectedly or if the situation deteriorated beyond government control. So here's the question we want to leave you with. If you discovered something like this, something that could threaten everything but that the government insisted should remain secret, what would you do? Would you trust the authorities to handle it, or would you warn everyone you could? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story as mind-bending as we did, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Make sure to click the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the mysteries that governments don't want you to know about. Because the signal beneath Montana is still humming, still intensifying, and time is running out to understand what it means. The question isn't whether something will emerge from that void. The question is whether we'll be ready when it does.